Today I want to find out if Prodigy has the best approach lineup ever made in all of disc golf. There are some other companies who could vie for that, but I want to first take a look at all the profiles of these discs. Then we're going to split them into a couple different categories because they're definitely not all made equal. We'll take a look at some normal use cases out on the course, actually right behind me, and then we'll go for a 6-hole CTP battle where we throw them on every angle, backhand and forehand, and determine the winner from each of the 3 groups and which is my overall favorite and if Prodigy does have the best approach lineup. It's pretty good. And these are all in the same plastic, which is really nice. Let's take a look at these 3 different categories of approach discs from Prodigy side by side to see why I classified them in these groups and what the differences are between them before you even get out and throw them, because these differences will make a difference as they get thrown. And honestly, only one of the differences seems to make sense to me so far. Let's take a look at the finesse guys. We have the Distortion over here and the A5. And honestly, if you look at them, they are very similar. The main differences, I think, are it's a little more rounded at the top of the A5. The bottom bevel is very similar, but the A5 is a little more rounded and a little tiny bit shallower on the top part. All right, here we're going to be looking at the A4 and the A3, which I kind of like to think about as mini gators because they both are a little bit blocky here. And then they have a bead at the bottom. Pull you guys down just slightly so you can see what I'm talking about. And to be completely honest with you, from looking at both of these guys, the main difference that I can see is just that this one, the A3, is ever so slightly shallower than the A4. They both have a little bit of dome that you guys can see here compared to both the A5 and the Distortion, which have a little bit of a puddle top as you can see. But the ever so slight difference in shallowness, as well as the only other thing I can notice is this seems to be slightly more beveled and this slightly more rounded, even though this one is supposedly a little bit more understable, as the numbers would suggest. We'll have to see if that bears out. And now it's time to look at the beefy boys. We have the A2 and the A1. The A1 does look like it has slightly more dome, at least here. I have some A2s that are very domey, so I think it probably just matters run to run. I am glad that we have all these in the same plastic. And to be honest with you, this just looks like they took the A2 and they added a bead to make it a little bit more less glidey and more overstable. But otherwise, these look like basically the exact same disc as you can see there, which a lot of times just adding a bead is what makes something more overstable, which is why you have the Luna and the Kratos that basically have that same exact story. Similar disc, just with a bead. Not a lot of other companies have this many varieties of offerings in the approach department. Innova is one that I think might rival Prodigy and give them a run for their money because they have now the Toro, which is a very zone-like disc. And honestly, the only other approach discs that I have are zones right here, which is most similar, I would say, to the Distortion. But the Distortion is slightly deeper and a little more rounded on the top. This one also has more puddle, but that might just be a plastic base because I do have puddle top zones. So Innova might be able to compare with Prodigy because they have Toro now, Pig, Rat, a bunch of other ones that not a lot of people are throwing in general. But then again, not a lot of people are throwing A3s and A4s as well. So before we get out and try to have a 6-hole scoring round with each of these, let's go and take a look at the flight for actual approach shots because we'll likely be throwing a lot of either very far approaches or drives with these when we actually go to score them on the par 3 course. I really like what Overthrow does sometimes in their reviews, and we're gonna look at some use cases. This is a par 4 here, hole 10 at Owl's End, 630 feet. The first shot for me is just a big, probably 400 and change foot hyzer, and then a backhand or a forehand into the green. And since this is basically exactly 200 feet, I'm 202 from the rangefinder. We'll throw forehands here. Do have a little bit of a right to left, so this will be a perfect show of the stability of these when you're nice and softly toned down. A5 first. And the Distortion. Those honestly seem to fly very similar to me, and they like to really kind of glide on that. I don't have to give them a lot of juice, and I do think that trying to torque into them makes them a little more finicky. Out of all these discs, they seem to have the most want to turn. Next are the A3 and the A4, which are surprisingly slightly different. The A5 and the Distortion, relatively similar. Here's the A4 first. It's not a terrible approach. Watch how differently I have to throw this A3 though. A lot more driven, a lot more nose down, has a lot of late stability and was gonna finish in the same spot if it didn't get a great tree kick. Next up, we have the A2 and the A1, which you've seen I'm sitting back in these approaches, just kind of chipping them up there
I'm gonna have to get my body into these. A2 first, which you've seen me throw a lot before if you've been on the channel. I used to bag one, still is an option to bag. I just only have the zone right now as an approach disc. A little juicy, could have thrown it a little softer, but the A1, we'll see what we need to do with this. Oh my gosh, I honestly thought that would have drifted over enough. Holy cow. We'll move up to 150 feet for the forehands, throw them on a more typical hyzer line and show you how wide you have to put them from the basket, and then we'll get into some backhand approaches before we see them off the tee. We're gonna act like there is a mando to the left of these trees, because this is a situation you can definitely find yourself in. Having to get up and down from, I think this will be the 162, 142 feet from right here. This is actually gonna be a really good show of how differently these are all gonna fly. Something like the A2 and the Distortion, which fly relatively similar, but very straight on a forehand. Actually kind of nice to have. I would prefer to throw these guys on hyzers always. To do that, we got the trees in the way, and so we're gonna have to take these a little bit higher. Whereas with like the A2, if I take it that high, it can obviously dump in by the basket, but I can also just trust it because of how overstable the A2 and the A1 are to just skip around those trees. So we'll go A5 first. Nice and hyzer around the tree. It's got a lot of glide and push, and that's the way to get to the basket. I like that it sits very soft. It doesn't have a lot of speed coming in. Distortion's probably gonna fly the exact same. Very similar, maybe a little more stability. It's hard. I think it's a little faster, like a little more speed. They call the A5 a 3-speed and the Distortion a 4-speed. Maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I don't know, they're very similar. Next are the A4 and the A3, which are gonna have similar flights, but this time instead of kind of taking them at a wide hyzer around the tree, I can take these at a lower hyzer and skip them, or I could take them a little bit higher over the tree. And I think because the A4 seems to have a little more push than the A3, I'll take the A4 over and the A3 under is how I would play these shots. Play that one pretty bad, huh? An A3. I don't like that. It has that less glide, more stability, and a big roll away from the basket to make up for what happened on the last hole. Now the A2 and the A1, I could take these up and over, but that brings a lot of wind into play. These do counteract the wind a little bit better, but I like just kind of getting a little skippy on the ground action. A2 first, I think I could throw this one on a little hyzer. A1, I'm definitely gonna have to throw flat. Terrible. Flat, gets to angle, almost skips in. I have another A2 to show what I mean, since that was so bad. I just didn't commit to it. Right in the same tree. Hopefully that shows you. The A1, gonna be a little more overstable. I probably could have thrown that flat shot with the A2 and it still got them to skip, but I think they do a good job of Distortion and A5 being very similar, and then everything does get more and more overstable as you get closer to the one department. Let's take a look at a couple, probably 200-foot approach backhands from a standstill as well. We're on hole 18 now. We're gonna pretend like we got a horrendous kick, and we're left here with, what is this, 162? Left with 198 feet into the basket. How would we attack it with each of these approach discs? And to be honest with you, the A5 and the Distortion are gonna be significantly harder to get close to the basket than the more overstable versions of all these discs. That's because with something like this, since it's not really gonna wanna move too far to the left by itself, it wants to more be straight, torque resistant, and get a little fade. You're gonna need to throw it a little bit higher to give it more time to move to the left, or something that just inherently wants to move to the left, you can throw a little lower and it'll get there and even skip. These, especially in semi-sandy ground, they're not really gonna skip. So if they're the Distortion here, the higher it is, the more it can filter through the trees, but we'll push this a little farther. A little higher and wider, and we've played ourselves into a nice 20-foot look. Those will likely be the farthest away from the basket out of any of these. The A4 has a little more glide, but a little more overstability. I think that's why when I threw it on the forehand high over the trees, I threw it very similar to those two discs, but because it's more overstable, it didn't really want to just chill and push forward. It already wanted to start getting to the right, even though it's a little glidier. So I could throw very similar shots to those, and they'll get even closer to the basket. The A3, if we throw this, instead of getting the height, we just throw this a little more inside. Since it's also not as glidey, we'll throw it a little harder because we need more speed since we're not throwing it as high in the air with time to move left. We're also gonna put it on a similar amount of hyzer and just have it get right to the basket. And that pushed right there. That's the closest one yet. Next, the A2 and the A1. These are gonna be fun. A2 I think is that same exact shot, just even a little bit harder, or the same exact shot and it just gets a little more left. And the A1, I think honestly from even here, we might need to give a touch of flex or flat out of the hand, which is crazy to think about. Just a little harder than the A3, and that is gonna be really, really close. And the A1. What a crazy disc. I can't believe it still got that close. Holy cow. So, distortion landed right here. The A5, just like I said, very similar. Just actually gave it the right distance. And this is still a makeable putt. But when you're kind of coming from that angle, you can't really push it in far enough. So you just leave yourself a putt that you airball with the camera in your hand. The A4 next, right here. Very similar to the A5, just a little bit more left and a little bit farther, because I probably threw it slightly harder. The A3, a little bit lower, a little more driven. Again, this is one that's most similar to my zone, so I'm throwing it very well parked. The A2 also threw a little harder than the A3, got even a little more left and parked. And for throwing the A1 flat, same distance as the A2, just barely not as left. No looker, and then I'll see you guys out on the course. Dang it. I'm never gonna make those. All right, let's get into a nice CTP battle. A1 versus A2, A3 versus A4, A5 versus distortion. I'll go ahead and show you guys one at a time. We'll start from the most understable seeming, and then the more interesting A3 and A4, and then we'll get to the beef. See who wins this part, and then I'll give you my final recommendations. I'm also gonna alternate the box, and I do like putting for a lot of my reviews, but since this is really kind of comparing three sets of 2 discs, we're gonna go ahead and just do CTPs this time. It'll also speed it up a little bit for me so I don't have to putt. A5 first, then distortion. So A5 versus distortion is up first. And you guys are gonna notice I was actually able to play a forehand hyzer hole, then I played a backhand flex shot, and then I played a forehand flex shot, and then a backhand hyzer, and then a backhand straight, and then a forehand straight or flat. That was the aim of all those shots. I did have to redo one of them because I just threw them really bad the first time, just to make sure that I got the right opinion on these discs. And to be completely honest with you, the A5 and the distortion, I think they got the same amount of CTPs. They both got 3 CTPs, and they were having almost identical flights the whole entire time. I would say that for this distortion, they likely just took the A2 and slightly changed the top to be a little bit more zone-like. I did throw the zone against it a couple times as well. I added in a zone just for this one, since it's pretty similar feeling. Pretty similar, zone's a little beefier. Once again, the zone, just so we have a forehand comp as well. A little beefier. As you saw both those times, it was just a little bit more overstable, maybe a little bit more consistent. Not quite A2, as we'll see. Hey, I'm just gonna quickly interject. I think it's kind of funny that the distortion is a 4-3-0-3 disc and the A5 is 3-4-1-1 because they are the same size around, seemingly. This is probably just the A5 with a different top, is what it would seem to me. And so they probably just wanted to change the numbers to be more in line with the zone, because I don't know when the A5 came out. It might have been alongside the zone, but the zone probably wasn't nearly as popular as it is now. And so they wanted something that flies like a trusted and tried and true A5, but has better numbers and then also is marketable because of Kevin Jones. Back to what I was saying. The distortion, I think, honestly had a little bit more play in the air. Could have been by a couple of bad throws, but I felt like I was getting a little bit cleaner with the A5. Not that it's necessarily better, but I think my preference between these two is kind of a coin flip, and I like the A5, especially with Kevin Jones leaving. I don't know what they're doing with the distortion, so if I definitely had to choose, I would choose the A5, and it's what I would consider for my bag. More for very straight approaches that have some torque resistance, but it did flip over a little bit. I'd maybe rather just still keep my zone, but I could see a place for this in my bag at some point. So technically they tied, but I'm gonna give the edge overall to the A5. Next are kind of the interesting like mini gator ones, the A3 and the A4. And when we looked at them initially and in terms of hand feel, the A3 just is that little bit shallower. And maybe because of that is a little bit meaner. Like this is a little, the A4 is a little bit blunter. The A3 is a little bit more rounded. And I was surprised by the differences. The numbers on the A3 are 4403 and the A4 are 44-1-2. And I would change those ever so slightly, but I was honestly initially surprised from the first throw that even though they felt very similar, the A4 was a good bit glidier than the A3. The A3, of course, is supposed to be more overstable as the numbers get lower, closer to 1. They tend to be a little bit more overstable in Prodigy's lineup. But the A4 is definitely a little bit glidier than the A3, but it still has some good hookup at the end. I do think that they are kind of like mini Gators or mini Gator 3s. They feel very similar to that. They're a little bit smaller diameter, and then they also fly with some overstable finish. The A3 specifically, I think, has very little glide. It's like if you take the A4 and the A2 and you smash them together, and guess what happens when you average 4 and 2? You get 3. So good job, Prodigy, on that.
That one whistles, what the heck?
I would probably give the A3 4203 for the flight numbers, and I would give the A4 4402. Not 44 -12, it's not gonna turn on you, but it does have some overstability for sure, as you guys are able to see. I think from these two, I would have to give it to the A4. I tend to want something a little bit glidier overall, and it's still like, it's not glidey, but it's a little bit more glidey than the A3, and if I want something that's like this, I'd probably rather go for the feel of the A2 because you can just hit it a little bit harder as well. This one didn't really hold up in the wind nearly as much as the A2 did, so I'm gonna go A4 and A5 so far. And then the last guys, the beefy boys, the A1 versus the A2. And you guys are just gonna see right off the bat, I don't know who would need the A1 necessarily. I think it's fun, and I think some people would use it. I think Ezra Robinson has one that was really old and beat up that he threw forever. The numbers of the A2 are 4403, and the A1 are 3303. So probably pretty accurate. I don't think that the speed needs to really change. They're the same diameter, and they seem to fly similar speeds. The A1 just has way less glide and a little bit more fade. I think specifically once we get to that flat backhand shot, the 5th one, you guys will see like out of the hand, I'm trying to throw these guys flat. Maybe there's a little hyzer on it, but both of them are just boom, they're on angle right after they get out of my hand. If you don't flex them at all and put that nose down on the flex, they're not gonna hold any turn at all. But the A1 just turned into a knife and was like 50 feet shorter than the A2 on a flat shot. I think you can definitely power up on it, but you need a lot of power to get some good utility from the A1. The A2, I think, you still will need a lot of power, and for some people it's gonna act like an A1 did for me today, but I think that the A2 is just a staple approach disc. It is so good. I've had it in the bag before. This made me want to put it back in the bag, but the zone is, it's more overstable than the Distortion A5 crowd, and it's closer to like an A3, A4, but a little more predictable. So I like the zone, and that makes me not feel like I need the A2, but I see a place for both of them in the bag at some point. If I had an ESP zone in the bag or an A5, I would definitely still be bagging an A2. And I think eventually it will go back in the bag, especially for some events, but A2 definitely has my nod, and I think it's my favorite approach disc from Prodigy, probably followed up by the A5. Really solid approach lineup, and I think overall I would say that Prodigy does have the best approach lineup in the game. They have something for everybody. Even if you're getting started, the A5 is going to act like that zone. If the zone's too overstable for you, the A5 or the Distortion are going to be that really overstable guy. And I think Luke Humphreys is the A5 guy. I think that's his thing, and Luke is awesome. So pick one of those up to support him. I'll have all these linked on Infinite if you want to pick them up. Thank you guys for watching. I really enjoyed this style of review, and I hope you did too. It was a lot of fun to make. Peace.